The generation that was told to go outside, drink from the hose, and be home when the streetlights came on is now being criticized for being too involved in their kids' lives. That contradiction alone tells you almost everything you need to understand about Gen X parents. They grew up in a cultural moment where independence wasn't just encouraged, it was assumed. If you were born in the late 60s, 70s, or early 80s, there's a strong chance you remember walking into an empty house after school. The key around your neck. The microwave hum. The silence. Both parents working, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of cultural shift. Between 1970 and 1990, the percentage of mothers in the workforce with children under 6 jumped dramatically. At scale, that changed childhood. You learned to solve problems because there was no one immediately available to solve them for you. You figured out how to make food. How to entertain yourself. How to navigate conflict. If you failed a test, you dealt with it. If you fought with a friend, you handled it. No email threads between parents. No school portals. No daily tracking apps. Just you and the consequences of your choices. And that kind of autonomy leaves a mark. It builds resilience, yes. It builds problem-solving ability. It builds a quiet confidence that says, I'll figure it out. But it also builds something else. A form of emotional self-sufficiency that can look like strength on the outside, but feel like isolation on the inside. When no one checks in consistently, you learn not to expect it. When no one intervenes, you stop asking. Over time, that becomes identity. Gen X was often described as one of the least parented generations in modern American history. Not because their parents didn't love them, but because economic realities and cultural shifts created distance. Supervision loosened. Expectations hardened. Emotions were often secondary to survival. So now fast forward. That generation is parenting. And suddenly the narrative flips. They're being labeled overly protective. Intensely involved. Hyper-aware. Sometimes even accused of overcompensating. But from a psychological standpoint, what you're seeing isn't overcorrection. It's integration. When Gen X parents talk about their childhoods, they often do so with clarity. They don't romanticize everything. They remember the freedom. The long afternoons outside. The creativity born from boredom. But they also remember the loneliness. The feeling of coming home to an empty house. The sense that no one was really watching closely. And when you become a parent, those memories don't disappear. They rewire your instincts. You may swear you'll give your kids the same independence you had. You may tell yourself you won't hover. But then your child comes home quiet one day. Or anxious. Or withdrawn. And suddenly, the memory of your own silence as a kid surfaces. The afternoons you wished someone would ask more questions. The moments you wished someone would notice. And something shifts. You don't want to erase your child's independence. But you also don't want them to feel invisible. Psychologist Diana Baumrind spent decades studying parenting styles and identified 2 primary dimensions that shape how parents raise children: responsiveness and demandingness. Responsiveness is emotional warmth and availability. Demandingness is structure, expectations, boundaries. When both are high, the result is authoritative parenting. Not authoritarian. Not permissive. Authoritative. It sounds similar, but the difference matters. Authoritarian parenting is strict without emotional support. Permissive parenting is warm without boundaries. Authoritative parenting is structured and emotionally present. It says, I care deeply about you, and I also expect you to grow. Research over decades consistently shows that children raised in authoritative environments tend to develop stronger emotional regulation, higher self-esteem, better academic performance, and healthier peer relationships. They learn consequences, but they don't learn fear. They experience boundaries, but they don't experience abandonment. Now, there's no massive data set proving Gen X parents collectively lean authoritative. But listen to how they talk. I want my kids to feel heard. I don't want them to struggle alone. But they still need to learn how to handle life. I'm here for them, but I'm not doing it for them. That's the framework almost perfectly. Gen X parents often describe themselves as hands-off until it matters. They'll let you navigate minor drama. They won't intervene in every conflict. But if something serious happens, bullying, academic issues, emotional distress, they don't hesitate. They show up. And when they show up fully. Some have called them stealth fighter parents. They're not hovering constantly. But when the situation demands it, they move fast and decisively. That intensity surprises people because it doesn't match the narrative of the detached latchkey childhood. But psychologically, it makes perfect sense. When you grow up learning that the system won't always protect you, you internalize that lesson. You watched economic stability crack. You graduated into recessions. You saw retirement promises dissolve. You witnessed corporate loyalty evaporate. Security became conditional. And when security becomes conditional, you don't promise your kids that everything will be stable. You prepare them to survive instability. Gen X parents don't parent from blind optimism. They parent from lived experience. They know that systems fail. Jobs disappear. Plans collapse. So they focus less on guaranteeing outcomes and more on strengthening internal resilience. But here's where it gets complicated. They're raising kids in a world that looks nothing like the one they grew up in. Gen X remembers privacy as normal. Embarrassing moments didn't live online forever. There were no digital archives of teenage mistakes. No social comparison metrics visible 24/7. Now they're raising children in an era where everything can be documented, judged, compared. And that tension is exhausting. They understand technology better than their boomer parents. They adopted the internet as adults. They learned to navigate it. They adapted. But they also remember life without it. They remember boredom. They remember offline presence. They remember not being constantly reachable. So when they set screen limits, it's not fear-based. It's experiential. They know what gets lost in constant connectivity because they experienced both worlds. They're fluent in technology. But they're skeptical of its cost. And that skepticism sometimes gets misinterpreted as rigidity by their kids. Meanwhile, their own parents may see their emotional involvement as softness. Gen X parents are caught between generations. The sandwich generation. Caring for aging parents who may not understand modern parenting norms. Raising children who exist in a digital ecosystem they never had to navigate at the same age. They translate constantly. Their parents might say, "You're coddling them." Their kids might say, "You're too strict." And in the middle is a Gen X parent trying to combine independence with presence. That balancing act requires enormous emotional energy. They're managing careers that may have plateaued. Financial pressures that feel heavier than expected. Retirement uncertainty. Healthcare costs. College tuition. And at the same time, they're trying to give their kids what they didn't always receive, consistent emotional availability. That emotional labor is invisible. They're often tired not because they're failing, but because they're holding multiple worlds together. One of the more interesting psychological traits often observed in Gen X is their relative indifference to external validation. Growing up with less supervision and fewer accolades meant you learned to calibrate internally. Approval wasn't constant. Feedback wasn't immediate. So now, as parents, they're less likely to obsess over appearing perfect online. They're less likely to chase parenting trends aggressively. They parent according to internal memory more than external commentary. That can make them seem detached from the competitive parenting culture that emerged later. But it can also make them grounded. They'll let their teenager fail a test and retake it. They'll let their child struggle through a social mistake rather than immediately intervening. They understand that repetition is part of learning. They understand that resilience isn't built through rescue. And yet, if that same teenager calls at 2 a.m. in crisis, they're awake. They're there. No lectures. No shame. Just presence. Because they remember what it felt like to not have someone to call. That duality defines Gen X parenting. Independence and protection. Boundaries and warmth. Skepticism and loyalty. They don't want their kids to grow up fragile. But they also don't want them to grow up alone. And that distinction matters. There's a quiet emotional complexity to Gen X parenting that doesn't get talked about enough. On the surface, they often look composed. Maybe a little dry. Maybe slightly sarcastic. They don't always gush publicly about every milestone. They're not necessarily broadcasting daily affirmations on social media. But that restraint shouldn't be mistaken for distance. If anything, many Gen X parents feel deeply, sometimes more deeply than they're comfortable expressing. Because remember, emotional expression wasn't always modeled for them. Many grew up in households where feelings were secondary to practicality. You handled it. You moved on. You didn't dramatize it. You didn't dissect it endlessly. So now, when they try to be more emotionally available with their own kids, they're often learning in real time. They're translating emotions that they themselves were never taught how to articulate. That's exhausting work. It's one thing to set rules. It's another to sit with your child's anxiety and not dismiss it. It's one thing to teach responsibility. It's another to validate sadness without rushing to fix it. Gen X parents are often trying to break patterns without having a blueprint. And that means they make mistakes. Sometimes they swing too far into protection. Sometimes they pull back too much, afraid of hovering. Sometimes they question themselves constantly, even if they don't show it publicly. Because they were raised in a system that said, figure it out. But they're parenting in a system that says, be emotionally attuned at all times. That's a massive shift. And it becomes even more complicated when you consider how dramatically the cultural environment has changed. Gen X grew up largely offline. Reputation was local. Social comparison was limited to school, neighborhood, maybe extended family. Mistakes faded over time. Now their children live in a hyper-connected ecosystem where every action can be screenshot, shared, amplified. Social hierarchies aren't just physical, they're digital. Validation is quantified. Comparison is constant. Gen X parents understand the benefits of technology. They've built careers with it. They rely on it. But they also understand what unfiltered exposure can cost. So when they set limits around screens, it's not because they're anti-technology. It's because they remember boredom. And boredom built creativity. It built problem solving. It built tolerance for silence. They want their kids to know how to sit with themselves. Not because they're nostalgic, but because they've lived long enough to know that constant stimulation erodes resilience. That tension, between using tools and questioning them, is uniquely Gen X. They're not intimidated by technology like older generations. But they're not fully surrendered to it like younger ones. They live in the in-between. And that in-between space defines much of their parenting. They don't micromanage every moment. But they also don't disappear. They don't assume the world will be stable. But they don't preach hopelessness either. They teach their kids to be self-sufficient because they know institutions can fail. But they also emphasize emotional connection because they know what absence feels like. There's also the reality of economic context. Gen X came of age during recessions. They saw corporate downsizing firsthand. They watched pensions disappear. They internalized that job security isn't guaranteed. So when they push their kids to develop skills, it's not just about achievement. It's about survival. But here's where nuance matters. They're not typically pushing from ego. They're not trying to live through their children in the same way some earlier generational stereotypes suggested. Many of them are pushing from caution. They want their kids prepared. At the same time, they're deeply aware of burnout culture. They've experienced overwork. They've seen hustle narratives collapse. So they often emphasize balance more than previous generations did. It's a strange duality: prepare them for instability, but don't let them lose themselves in the process. That balancing act requires constant recalibration. And then there's the sandwich generation pressure. Many Gen X parents are simultaneously caring for aging parents while raising teenagers or young adults. They're managing medical appointments on one end and college applications on the other. They're navigating generational misunderstandings daily. Their parents might say, "Why are you so involved?" Their kids might say, "You don't understand." So Gen X becomes the translator. They explain social media dynamics to boomers. They explain economic realities to Gen Z. They try to maintain respect across radically different worldviews. And translation is emotional labor. It's also identity labor. Because Gen X has never fit neatly into cultural narratives. They were often described as cynical. independent, detached. But beneath that detachment was adaptability. They adapted to shifting economies, to technological revolutions, to changing family structures. And now they're adapting parenting itself. One of the most overlooked strengths of Gen X parents is their tolerance for imperfection. They don't tend to chase parenting perfection the way some contemporary culture encourages. They're less likely to curate flawless family images, less likely to obsess over appearing ideal. Why? Because they didn't grow up in a performative parenting culture. They grew up figuring things out without constant supervision. So they understand that development is messy. That growth includes mistakes. That resilience often comes from repetition. They'll let their kid make the same mistake twice if it means the lesson sticks. That can look like indifference to outsiders. But it's often intentional. They don't want to rescue prematurely, because they know rescue can rob competence. At the same time, they don't disappear emotionally. They check in. They listen. They validate. Even if that language feels awkward sometimes. There's something else that shapes Gen X parenting: skepticism. They grew up during media shifts that exposed institutional failures. They witnessed political scandals, corporate corruption, broken promises. So they don't blindly trust systems. And that skepticism often translates into encouraging their kids to question, to think critically, to not accept narratives at face value. They're not raising blind followers. They're raising navigators. And navigators need both confidence and humility. Gen X parents want their kids to feel secure in themselves, not just secure in external approval. That's why they often prioritize internal compass over external applause. They don't obsess over trophies as much as growth. They don't panic over every setback. They've lived long enough to know that setbacks don't define trajectories. But here's the emotional undercurrent. Many Gen X parents still carry remnants of that latchkey loneliness. It doesn't always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as hypervigilance. Sometimes as overpreparation. Sometimes as deep protectiveness when their child feels overlooked. They remember invisibility. So they try to see their kids clearly. And in doing so, they sometimes become more emotionally present than they ever experienced. Not perfectly. Not flawlessly. But intentionally. They're breaking cycles while preserving strengths. They want their kids to have independence, but not isolation. They want their kids to develop resilience, but not emotional numbness. They want their kids to question systems, but not lose hope. That combination doesn't fit into neat categories. But Gen X has never cared much about neat categories. They weren't the loudest generation. They weren't the most mythologized. But they were adaptive. And now that adaptability is shaping how they parent. They may look tired sometimes. Because they are. They're carrying economic uncertainty, technological shifts, aging parents, digital parenting norms, and their own unresolved childhood memories, all at once. But they're also showing up. Emotionally present in ways that weren't always modeled for them. Holding boundaries without abandoning warmth. Letting their kids struggle without letting them drown. And maybe that's the quiet revolution of Gen X parenting. Not perfection. Not performance. Integration. Taking the freedom of their childhood and combining it with the emotional availability they wished they'd had. Raising kids who feel both capable and connected. And doing it in a world that changes faster than anyone predicted. If you're a Gen X parent and this resonates, you're not imagining the tension. You're not overcomplicating it. You're navigating a uniquely complex intersection of history, psychology, and culture.